A ja nie widzę Rebeki tutaj w tym
I can't seem to see
monitorze. To jest okay?
Rebecca on
Dobra.
the screen, but I hope it's
Dzień dobry
okay
wszystkim.
still that
Hi
I
Rebecca,
can't see
how
her.
are you?
I'm here.
Do you hear me well?
I can, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Okay. Say hello to everybody, to the audience here inside and to the audience in the front of the computers and laptops and whatever. It is strange times.
Hello, everyone, everywhere.
Yes, and I would like to introduce to Rebecca Makkai. The first novel of her in Poland in the March was launching. It was Great Believers. I'm sure most of us read this book, or I hope if you don't, so this great experience is in front of you. I'm jealous because I finished this book and I have feeling that something's finished in my life. Of course, if you have a pleasure and have a moment to answer any questions, so anytime you can do it. And of course the same to the people who are in front of the screens. Please, if you have any question to Rebecca, please ask anything. I'm wondering, first of all, how do you feel the online life?
It's not my favorite. I don't think it's most people's favorite thing, but it's been lovely to be able to be at conferences like this in places where I might not have been able to travel under normal circumstances. So there's a silver lining. There's some enjoyable aspects to it, but
where is the epidemic?
It's a stress.
I'm sorry. I have to remember not to disturb you during this conversation because you hear me well. I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries.
Okay. And where did you, where the epidemic and the pandemic time was? What did you do? Were you at home with your daughters, and what did you do?
Yes, I had a lot of travel canceled this spring and this summer. Polish was not the only translation for this book to be coming out. So I was scheduled originally to be in Germany, to be in Paris, and a bunch of places in the US, and that all fell through, which was sad, but I was able to do things online. And basically, I stayed here. I'm a little bit north of Chicago, just stayed home with my children, and we played a lot of board games, watched movies, and got out on our bikes. And things are still pretty shut down here in the U.S. Because it hasn't been handled very well here. It's lovely that you're able to start opening things back up. We're not there yet.
I would like to ask you, how is the mood in Chicago now?
Everyone's stressed out. It's the good thing about Chicago, at least in the summer, we have a very short summer, so everyone's at least outdoors, enjoying themselves. And things might look very different in the winter. We have a long, cold winter. No one's, it's frustrating. The economy is bad. Politics are bad. This virus is bad. But we are so grateful for sunshine in Chicago that everyone's in a little better mood.
Okay. I'm wondering, you wrote some books, and the first one in Polish is The Great Believers. Is it your favorite one? Or if you have to, I know it's author is quite hard to talk about their children, but is it the most important book at this moment for you? And why?
Yes.
If it is.
It is. I think that your most recent book should always be your favorite, the most important. But also, this book has meant more to me in terms of audience reception, the letters that I get, the emails that I get, the travel that I've been able to do. I've been able to connect with people who lived through this directly. I've been hearing from younger people who maybe are LGBTQ, but didn't live this history and have been introduced to it through the book. There's just a different level of connection. So now my job is to fall in love with my new book that I'm writing now. So I have to go and do that now. And hopefully that will become my favorite. but I don't know for sure. This one, it did things to it did things for my writing that other books have not. It made me a different kind of writer, and it's had a different kind of life out in the world than my other books have had.
I'm wondering, because when I was reading this book, for me this book, of course, it's mainly about AIDS topic, and this is the bright side of this book, but the book is such universal because there are so many stories inside, you know, the relationship between mother and daughter, the friendship, the love, the betrayals, of course, the disease, the politics, the money, the power, the academic sides, lots of things, right? Why you make such a lots of levels in this book to show that the emotions and the fears of us, they are in everyone? In every relation?
There were several reasons. You know, you make a decision when you start to write a book about the scope of that book. Is this going to be a narrow focus? Is it going to be broad? Is it going to be well populated? Several things pushed me towards making this a bigger book. One was just the timeline of the disease. That AIDS is a virus with a 5-year incubation period before you see symptoms. So if I was really going to show the effects of this disease on individual people, it needed to be a saga. It needed to be a long book. And there needed to be other things happening. You know, if it's only about AIDS, then you can see the ending coming a mile away. You know what's going to happen to people's lives. And it's not accurate. You know, the AIDS epidemic, the ongoing AIDS epidemic and the early days of the AIDS epidemic came onto and into people's lives even as, you know, they were busy, full lives. It wasn't an empty life and here comes AIDS and it takes over. It's a full life full of family relations and careers and love stories and politics and the city and everything else that's going on. So it wouldn't have felt fair or accurate to narrow the scope and just talk about this one issue.
You grew up in these times exactly when it was the peak of this pandemic in Chicago, right? You are 7 years old because we are in the same, from the same year, so I know exactly how old are you. What do you remember about this time? What was the impulse to write about the AIDS?
Right. You know, if you are the same age as me, and I don't know the differences, you know, in terms of Poland, but it's not so much for me that it was right immediate. It wasn't, I didn't have a family member with HIV. I didn't see people dying in the hospital, but it was the world that I acclimated myself to. I became aware of the world as the world was becoming aware of AIDS. I became aware of politics as politics was dealing with AIDS. I became interested in pop culture as pop culture was processing AIDS. And a lot of my early memories of this epidemic, it's not about an individual I knew or saw. It's about what I absorbed from the world, the way people talked about it, what was on the talk shows, what was on the news, what was in the movies. Even watching the Oscars, the Academy Awards as a kid, they would play the in memoriam reel at the end, who's died. And at a certain point, it started to be all of these beautiful young men. And you just absorb that year after year. So it was something that I knew intimately in many ways. And certainly as an adult, I have friends who are HIV positive. I know a lot more about it. But there was a lot that I needed to learn, especially about those early years. I had an impression, but not an understanding.
And what's left in the people around you, the pandemic time in Chicago? Something good, something bad? It's changing something really?
You're talking about right now?
Yeah. From the, from when you take a look back on these times, and because now in the world we are in the similar moment, yes, because this pandemic connecting with our health, right? Health that is for everyone something the most valuable in their lives, but now it's not connecting the special group of people, but everyone. So I'm wondering if there is any lessons from these times from Chicago.
Right. There are echoes. And I think it's important, we don't want to oversimplify and say, oh, two pandemics, they must be the same. Or no, they're completely different in every way. I think we all learned in school to compare and contrast, what's in common, what's different. And that's a valuable thing to be doing right now. There are certainly similarities in terms of, at least in the US, the ways that our very bizarre, broken healthcare system is failing us, the ways that it instantly gets politicized and certain politicians think they can ignore it. There are similarities in the US where as soon as this administration realized that it was largely African American and Latinx populations that were dying from COVID in the US, suddenly it became an issue that they didn't want to have to deal with anymore. They felt like they could ignore it. And that's very similar to what happened in the beginning with HIV and what's happening now with HIV in the US. It's largely, we have, 1.1 million Americans right now living with HIV. It's largely Black and brown populations. It's still largely, but not entirely, queer populations. And it's simply not in the news. It's not discussed. We're back to that original silence that surrounded it. So I think there are incredible similarities. There are also differences, certainly, in that there's no stigma around COVID. There's no sense that you got it because you deserved it. There's no sense that, maybe someone has this idea, but in the general population, there's no sense that this is a punishment from God. And those things, were all true of HIV and continue to be true in people's perceptions.
But do you think it's changed really after these years? Or it's still the same, stigmatization? A little bit.
HIV, I think with the general population, there's much less stigma, but there's also much less awareness. When I lecture about great believers in the US, and I keep getting told by people who have not yet read my book, they find out what my book is about, and they say, isn't it great that we cured it? Which of course is, there are 1 billion people dying globally of AIDS every year. We have not cured this disease. People are really uninformed. So I think that where people might see themselves as more tolerant and, oh yes, that was such a sad era, and if I had been in a position to help, I sure would have helped. And it's still an issue. We still need help. And there's maybe not the same stigma from most people, the same dismissal from most people, but there's a lot of ignorance still. So it has changed, but it's not, and certainly medicine has changed, education has changed, but there's still an enormous number of ongoing problems with the HIV epidemic that are being ignored. And maybe something like COVID, in the US, it's certainly making people rethink our healthcare system, the ways that we treat disease, the ways that we treat epidemics. Maybe when this is all over, this will be an opportunity for people to understand HIV better as well.
Maybe for everyone that the health system is very important and we have to battle for it a little bit, right? But this pandemic you wrote in your book is also about the loneliness. And it was really, really amazing how you show it. And I think so the COVID and the HIV pandemic you wrote, they have the connection, because I think for me that's quite a little bit about loneliness between people. Never mind it's HIV or it's coronavirus or something like that. Do you think that this loneliness will be, how we can fight with this loneliness in such times?
That's a good question. I think people are trying with online things. really valuing the friendships that they have. People are, I think once this is over, I think we will have a greater appreciation for being able to gather, for being able to celebrate, for being together. I think I've been rethinking the 1920s lately, because I always thought that the reason everyone was in such a partying mood in the 1920s was they were so happy that the First World War was over. And now I'm wondering if they were just so glad to be out of quarantine after the influenza of 1918. Maybe it was all this pent up loneliness that made people want to go out dancing, that made people want to connect in that way.
Mm-hmm. And why Paris? Have you ever been in Paris? Why does Paris topic is in this book? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I have spent a lot of time in Paris, and of course, who doesn't love Paris? It's fun to write about. The story actually started with the Paris thread of the book. Right, the way it stands now, for people who haven't read it, it's mostly set in 1980s Chicago, but there is this other thread. First of all, of 2015 Paris, where a survivor of that time is dealing with her past. But there's also a thread of Paris Paris in the teens and 20s. And the Paris before and after the First World War, that was the storyline that I originally started the book with. I wanted to write the story of a woman looking back on her life and her life as an artist's model. Mm-hmm. I was really fascinated with the idea of what it would mean to be a muse for artists, but not quite be able to make your own art. That was the book that I wanted to write. And I figured if she was looking back from the end of her life, just doing the math on that, she couldn't have lived much past the 1980s. So the end of her life is going to be the 1980s. And at that point, I realized I have a book about the art world set in the 1980s. It will deal with the AIDS epidemic in some way. I just had no idea how much that would become the heart of the book. It would become the thing that I was obsessed with, the thing that I spent years researching, and it's the bulk of the book.
Okay. It's because I don't know if everybody was reading this book, because it's fascinating how you transform it between, you always switch on the new word, the different word, back to the 80s in Chicago, back to the 2015 in Paris. You have to switch off very fluently, and you can not lost in this book. It's amazing. But between is there a gap? And I think so now we live in a gap between the word we knew already that it maybe was wrong, right, but it was somehow in order, and the word that is coming, and we don't know what's happened next to us. We are all in fear and all the speculations and so on and so on. I'm wondering, what is your vision of the future? What will be the next after this pandemic time? Do you have any speculations about it?
That's a great question. I think that, like I said, I hope that we have, we have the 20s ahead of us. Maybe let's have the 20s again. Let's have the good parts of the 20s, right? The enjoying it. If we get out of this, if we're able to reconnect, we at least have that. I think it's a very volatile time in politics, globally, at least in Europe and the US. Half my family is in Hungary, and so I follow Hungarian politics. That's going through an interesting time. I think we're seeing this sort of wider and wider swings of the pendulum politically. A party comes to power, and then it swings even farther the other way, and then even farther the other way. And that's not historically a great sign. That's a volatile, problematic thing. I just don't know. I try to remind my children, I remind my daughters that they're living through history and that we should remember all of this. They're going to tell their grandchildren about this one day. And that telling them that helps me remind myself that. that, you couldn't choose. Sometimes you look back and you think, oh, I would have loved to live in the 1890s. That would have been so wonderful. But then you think, well, that was only one decade. And, where would your life start and where would your life stop? That's a life that's going to include global war. That's a life that's going to include horrible racism and sexism. And, so any lifetime, we can look back at a certain decade and say, that was nice. But any lifetime, I think, at this point in history, the past, since the dawn of civilization, is just going to include tumult. And I would imagine there's a lot of it ahead. I think that we have a chance here in the U.S. this upcoming election to have some kind of return to normalcy, some semblance of normal. Joe Biden is a fairly moderate candidate, and I'm not moderate politically. I'm a lot to the left of Joe Biden, but maybe moderate would be a nice break for everybody for a minute. I just don't know. And it's funny because I think there's a sense in which writers, fiction writers, our job is to talk about the past and about the present, but it is also to talk about the future. Even just, you're writing a book and it will come out for 3 or 4 or 5 years. What is everyone going to be wanting to read about in 3 or 4 or 5 years? And all you can do is try to tap into something that seems true, something about humanity that seems true, and see if that still holds by the time your book is out, by the time. And in this case, here I am, I'm writing about the AIDS epidemic with absolutely no idea that we're on the brink of another pandemic, a very different pandemic. But I think the reason that it's echoing with people now is that I wrote about something real. I wrote about something that we did deal with that is an issue. And of course, that issue then, okay, it comes up again. So I know I'm not answering your question. It's just the problem is I'm not psychic.
So you're a fairy tale because you just published this book exactly in this time of starting pandemic in Poland, exactly in the March. So that's why so it's close, the very book discloses to people. As you said, back to normal in USA. What you mean, normal? What you mean normal in nowadays?
I mean, I think that we would all love to at least wake up in the morning and not turn on our phones and go and kind of go, okay, what happened? What have I missed that's terrible? Did he threaten someone with nuclear war? Did he invade Portland, Oregon? Did he, it's just, there's this constant stress of living. It's not only that, of course, the majority of Americans cannot stand Trump's policies or his positions. It's that he is so wildly unpredictable. I think anyone who, you think about the equivalent of someone living in an abusive marriage, and it's the not knowing one moment to the next, which version of that person is going to walk through the door. Is it the angry person? Is it the violent person? Is it the sad person? Is it the drunk person? And I think that just, I would take a boring Republican at this point, someone who I never would have voted for in the past, just someone who's not going to be making horrifying news every day. Just someone who can go, yep, I hate his policies and they're the same today as they were yesterday. And he said the same things in this speech as he said last time, rather than it's vertigo, it's constant vertigo right now, on top of everything else.
We have the same.
And I would love a nice boring politician.
To be normal. We have, I don't know if you know how about the politics in Poland. I'm not good at politics at all, but we have a quite similar situation here. And how the situation with LGBT, have you heard about this maybe? What's going on in Poland now?
It's interesting. I've heard more than I might otherwise have, simply because I have been getting emails from Polish readers. And so it's not so much that I've been following, news websites or anything like that, but I will get messages on Twitter, or I'll get emails from LGBTQ people in Poland referring to what's going on in Poland, talking about their own experiences, and talking about the book and what it meant to them. So I've been filled in almost on a person by person level, which has been a remarkable, wonderful way to connect with people and to learn a bit more about what's happening there.
But I think so. Do you think that just prejudices can be disappeared when you back to the history? Like with the homosexual people, now they are stigmatizing in Poland, terrible. Of course, because it's connected with the political situation and the Catholics and so on, so on. But in your book is the nice sentence that the one prejudice, I can't tell this word. It's only ageism because it disappears when you're getting older. And the rest of them, we have to live with them or we have to fight about them.
Right. Prejudices, I think, is the word that you're saying, right?
Yes.
I can't say anything in Polish. I can say pierogi. I think that comment that a character makes about ageism, it was something that struck me just as a thought as I was writing the book completely separately, thinking, it's the one prejudice that takes care of itself if you live long enough. It's not as if every straight person eventually turns gay. It's not as if every white person eventually turns black. But every young person, if you're lucky, eventually becomes old. And I would say that every healthy person eventually becomes sick. I would say that's another one, whether that's in age or because of bad luck. But other than those, it's a matter of educating each other, educating ourselves. I'll say that it's interesting what's happening in the US right now, that despite this very right-wing administration, LGBTQ groups, Black Americans, all kinds of groups that have traditionally been very much marginalized are speaking out louder than ever. There's a lot of protesting, there's a lot of fundraising, there's a lot of action, and things are coming, we're dealing, I think, in some really important ways with things under a friendlier administration. Some people were able to take it for granted that those problems were solved. If you were a straight white person and Obama was president, you could pat yourself on the back and say, we solved everything, there's no more racism, this is great. But in fact, it continued to be a huge structural ongoing problem. So I do think that we have it. I can't speak to Poland, but I know that in the US, the stress of this moment is encouraging people to speak out, to be more vocal in their writing, in their protesting, in their social media presence. I know that that's not possible everywhere in the world to be vocal. It's at least at this point, it's a privilege that we do have in the US. We can be loud and obnoxious, as we're known for being. I feel like in some ways it's a terrible image, but we're like popping a giant zit on the face of America, at least right now. Like, ew, look at all this stuff that's in here, but at least we're getting it out. At least we're talking about it. At least we're doing something. Not to be too optimistic, but I do think that loudness is our friend right now.
But do you think it's because of people think that they have nothing to lose at this moment, and there is a moment in the world that they have to do something and to fight about their rights because nobody cares about until now the governments that are a little bit cheating the people, and this in the critical situation like this coronavirus pandemic, that we are, you know, without medicine, without a good healthcare system, and so on, without respect to each other, because that's also the problem of this last months. So, do you think that people have the fear, and in the same time feeling that they have nothing to lose at this moment?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think I see a very strong parallel there to the AIDS activists of the 1980s and the early 1990s. The demonstration that I write about at the end of The Great Believers, it's an ACT UP demonstration, which is an organization with chapters in many cities in the US. It was what ACT UP was doing in the 1980s, it was extreme. They were doing whatever they could to get attention. It wasn't violent, but they interrupted Catholic Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, for instance, which really upset a lot of people. They would take over city blocks and stop traffic. They would do whatever they could. They were doing these things. In some cases, these were people who had never been political. And then as a gay person, they have HIV or their friends are dying of AIDS. They became activists, and those who survived often stayed activists for life. They got out there because they had nothing to lose, and also because they felt like they were already losing everything. In the process of agitating for policy change around AIDS, actually made tremendous strides as well in LGBTQ acceptance, in awareness, in saying, you know, we all need to come out, people need to understand that they have gay friends and family. You know, where if you look at, for instance, gay pride parades, in the earliest days, the only people marching were people who already worked in a gay bar. And then by, you know, through the 1980s, you had all kinds of people who, you know, 10 years earlier would not have been comfortable showing their face, identifying, being out. But AIDS was part of what pushed them there. And those parades then, those demonstrations, that helped visibility, that helped acceptance, that helped people understand how normal, how common being gay is. So I do think that, and again, I end up sounding so optimistic in interviews when I'm not actually very optimistic. But I think, you know, moments of crisis push us out of our comfort zones. They push us to stand up for ourselves and to speak out for others too, who we feel responsible for. And if nothing else, this is such a moment.
But I think so. You said some minutes ago that education is the most important thing, that we have to fix it from the beginning. I think so around the world generally, maybe in Poland for sure. But have you? I know you were a teacher in Montessori school. Why you decided to finish this part of your life and start to writing? You never back to teaching?
Okay, so I was always writing. To be clear, I was writing from high school, you know, wanted to be a writer. But you can't graduate from college and go become a novelist. So I needed another career in the meantime. I was a Montessori student as a child and loved Montessori education. So I accepted a job doing that, teaching elementary. Sometimes people think that means very young children. It was 10, 11, 12-year-olds. Very smart, very amazing kids. I was doing that teaching at the same time that I was writing my first novel. And I was writing a lot of short stories, and they were being published and anthologized. And at a certain point, it was about a year after my first novel came out, felt like the right time to stop that kind of teaching, because I needed to travel for the books. I needed to be able to attend a book festival. I needed to be, I needed to write the next one a bit faster. That first one took me 10 years. I also, at that point, had 2 children of my own, and having 2 children and a full-time job and a full-time career as a writer was too much. So I still teach. I teach graduate students and adults creative writing, and just, I love teaching. It's a different kind, certainly, of teaching. But there's, if you're teaching Montessori kids in that age, there's a lot of what they do is tremendously creative. And when I teach now, that's what I'm doing, is I'm living in the creative worlds of the writers whose books I'm working on with them, seeing, kind of, entering into their imaginative space and seeing what it is that they do. But my kids are in Montessori now too, so I'm very much in that world. I'm just not in the classroom.
If you are a teacher, so what, according to you, is the best way to learn tolerance people?
Not to be cheesy, but I would say reading, and honestly, film. Those are the ways that we tell, the storytelling, essentially. Whether that's a novel, whether that is a podcast, whether that is a movie, whether that's a television show. Without that component to your life, you are living one single life, which is sad, for one thing. But you never are going to understand anything outside of your own experience. And the more we absorb story, the more we are understanding multiple lives, multiple possibilities. And so many of the cultures or identities that I feel like I have an understanding of that are not my own, it has come from reading, from movies. I was talking earlier just about my understanding of AIDS as a child being through movies, through television, eventually through books, which led me then into certainly the research that I needed to do. That wasn't enough, but that was the beginning of the interest in that. That was the beginning of the understanding. I think about a country I've never been to, like India. I know actually a lot about India, and I know it almost entirely through novels. Just the number of novels that I've read from Indian authors that are set in India, and I think about my accumulated knowledge of India, maybe a few movies, some friends from India, certainly. It's mostly from novels. And once you know a culture, once you know a person, once you know an identity, it's a lot harder to dismiss them. It's a lot harder to be biased against them.
How long did you take to write this book, and how long do you have to travel, and how you manage your life? You have 2 kids, and how it's going on when you write such a 500 pages book? You have to recognize your life totally, head to toe.
Yeah, it's not 500 pages in English.
It's more.
It's longer.
In Polish, it's more.
You should see the German one. It's so big. But it is a long book, even in English. It took about 3 years to write, and a significant amount of that was research. I live in Chicago, and so I didn't need to travel for research. The Paris research, because I've spent enough time in Paris, I could rely on Google Street View, going into a little Google map, and certainly some of the events that I write about in Paris of 2015, it was, research, but it didn't involve travel. So I spent a lot of time getting coffee, getting lunch with people that I needed to talk to learn more about AIDS in Chicago at that time. But it wasn't far from home. And so I might have, dropped my kids at school, exercised, showered, driven into the city, had coffee with someone, taken notes, gotten an interview in, and then stayed in the coffee shop and written for 2 hours after they left. And then I come back and I get my kids. And in the evening, I do all my email and all the business side of being a writer. But if you're writing for 2 hours a day, if you're writing 1,000 words a day, that gets a book written. So it's not like I need to go find a cabin in the woods. This is squeezing something in a coffee shop, or recording myself on my phone as I'm driving, or thinking about the book as I'm grocery shopping. I'm always reminding my students that writing does not mean typing necessarily. You don't need to be at your computer to be working on what you're doing. So honestly, even as busy as my life can be, and with traveling to promote previous books and everything, nothing is ever as busy as teaching elementary school was. That was, 8 hours a day, no break, nonstop. And now, if I write for 2 hours and I get to go do yoga, I feel very lucky. It does not feel all that busy compared to what my life used to be.
You said you were talking with a lot of people to make a research into this book. What was the greatest fear of these people this time in Chicago when it was, on the highest point of this pandemic then?
I mean, it was absolutely life and death for most of them. The test for HIV didn't become available until late 1985. And so the early period, 1981, people become aware of this virus. It's 4.5 years later, this test is available. People simply had no idea if they were going to get sick and be dead in a week. If they'd had this for years, there's just absolutely no way to tell, and there's absolutely no medication. There's a line, I believe the doctor, Yale's doctor in the book says something like this, but I spoke to more than one doctor in Chicago who said, they tended to be gay doctors working in the gay community, but doctors who said, I was treating men who I had slept with, and they were dying of AIDS. So I was assured that I had AIDS and I was going to die. And then they didn't, actually. I think in cases of the doctors I spoke to, did not have HIV. But just this assumption that we probably all have this. The gay community probably, who knows. And then those fears came true for so many people, that entire groups of friends, there were no survivors, entire communities. And it depended a little bit on the group, the dance community. I didn't even write about this in the book, really. Dancers, first of all, it's a very tight-knit community, very, gay happy. And dancers, even now, do not tend to have health insurance of any kind. And it's a big problem. I mean, it's America. I don't know what is going on, but it's a big problem in the dance community, just even with injury, because you sprain your ankle dancing, and they don't have. Whereas for actors, you can join the Actors Guild and you can get insurance through that. Dancers don't have the equivalent. So the dance community in New York, in Chicago, in San Francisco, it was just a level of devastation that was almost completely wiped out, those men. So, your people's fears, they might have turned out to be safe after all. But in many cases, that fear of, all of my loved ones, all of my friends, all of my chosen family, me, my partner, are going to be gone, and nobody's going to care. It's not making the news. It's not, Ronald Reagan, who was president through most of the 1980s, he did not say the word AIDS in public until 1987. basically refused to acknowledge it. There was some money being spent on it, but very little, and he wouldn't talk about it. And it's screaming for help, screaming for your life, and nobody's listening. And that's terrifying. That's the stuff of a literal nightmare, that you're screaming and no one can hear you.
But it's when I hear you, it's like in the Polish, the LGBT movement. It's maybe not the right words now, but in English. So they feel like they have to fight for the rights to make a real relationship, to have the rights like the other people's, because they are not the worst one, because of there's something natural with them, right? It's nothing imagination or so.
Right.
So that's the same idea, but they are much more normal people, and we have to prove the world that they are normal people. That must be frustrating, really, for people, that you are at the same level as the other and they have the same right.
Yeah. I saw recently a study just about the physical effects of stress when you're having maybe you're fine, you're at home, you're healthy, whatever, but the stress of your identity being a matter of debate, the stress, the just stress on the body of people on the news, people in politics debating whether your life should be valued, whether that's because of race or gender or sexuality. Simply that set of circumstances, even if no one comes up and spits on you, just that idea that that's a topic of debate, that you are a topic of debate, is an enormous physical stress, and stress on your health, stress on your mental well-being. And I don't have the solution to that, but it's horrid. It's horrid to be in a position, and I think some people will never understand that because they'll never be in that position where their value as a human is up for debate.
You finished, yes. I have to ask people if they have any question because we are talking, and maybe someone of you want to ask someone from Rebecca? No. Any question? No. All right. Rebecca, I'm sorry, but I think so. Do you read this book, maybe? Or most of you are in front of this book, or just over it? Over it. Because for me, when Paulina Wilk told me that I have to talk about this book, she said, "You will be crying." And I said, "Really? I never cry. I don't cry reading a book for many times." And I was waiting for this moment. And it's really this moment when you start to cry on this book. It's amazing because for a long, long time, I haven't read such an emotional book, which touch every emotions on me. When you was writing this book, have you cried?
Oh, yes. I think if I didn't, I would know something was wrong. I would. That would be a big problem if I could get through this book without feeling those emotions. I also certainly cried as I was interviewing people. I became very close to a number of the people that I interviewed for the book. What happened with the interviews, I'll say, is that there is a good deal written in the US about AIDS in New York and AIDS in San Francisco. But there is literally nothing in book form. There's no book about AIDS in Chicago. There's no nonfiction book. There's no documentary about AIDS in Chicago. So I was immediately forced, and I think this was the best, but I was forced into archives. So, weekly newspapers from the era that I could dig up, and interviews with people who had lived through it. Of course, I might have been shy about that, maybe, if I hadn't had to do it. But I learned so much more by speaking to people by listening to their stories. Partly, you get the emotional texture, you get just a sort of osmosis in what they're saying of how scared they were, how they felt about something, if they trusted this test when it came out. There were also just tiny details, things. Sorry.
Do you have water?
Swallowed wrong. Tiny details that never would have come up in a book. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example, which is that in the third chapter of the book, which is my character Yale's second chapter, he has lost track of his friends. He's in the city. He's in Boys Town, which is the gay section of the city. And it's 1985. And I had him walking down the street. And I had him looking through the windows of these bars, of these gay bars, to try to find his friends. And I knew these gay bars, they're still there. I felt like I knew them pretty well. But I was talking to a man in his 60s who was telling me about the bar scene in Chicago. And he mentioned in passing something that I should have thought of, that you could not look through the window of a gay bar in 1985. The windows were all painted black or covered with heavy curtains or stuffed with plants or any number of other things because people didn't want to be seen. That was important that I get that right. If I'd gotten that wrong, for one thing, people who knew better might laugh at me. That's one thing. But also, I'd be doing a disservice to that real lived history. I wouldn't be accurately telling you the scrutiny and the fear and the darkness that people were living under. And I needed to have those interviews to get that experience. But then along with that, of course, I was taking people back emotionally to a time that was very difficult for them. And, in several cases, someone would start to tell me a story and then they wouldn't be able to continue. They couldn't finish. I didn't need them to because I don't need the details of. It's just the emotion and the psychology, honestly, of long-term survivor's guilt. What does it mean to be given a death sentence when you're 25 and you assume you have a few months to live, and 30 years later you're still here? What does that do to you? What does it do when you lose everyone you're close to in your 20s and you're the only one to make it? What does it do? What about, I had one situation, someone was telling me, he was talking about a friend who had died, and he stopped himself and he said, I feel really strange talking about him because when he died, we were so close. But in the intervening 3 decades, I've gone on to have much more meaningful, long-lasting friendships, relationships. If he had lived, we probably would have drifted apart. But because he died when he did, I'm in charge of his legacy, his memory, and I don't feel worthy of that. Which was, that's a really complicated emotion to be happening. And I knew at a certain point that I wanted these sections of the book set in 2015 so that I could deal with those psychological components, that question of memory and grief and guilt and what happens over the long haul. Which is all to say, because you asked me about crying, I'm giving you a very long answer, but those conversations were really intense. They were really emotional. I became very close to almost everyone I interviewed. And that was where I did most of my crying, or later transcribing those interviews, typing them into my computer, re-listening to the audio. I just kind of lost it. But that needed to be there. I can't evoke those emotions from you if I have not felt those myself, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. What's your favorite person in this book? And I'm wondering, Fiona, Yale, or Charlie, or somebody, and why? Who is the most of, closer to your heart?
Definitely not Charlie. Yale is the most similar to me. It's funny because Fiona being more, a woman, a straight woman, and later, but she's not, she's really not me in her temperament, where Yale is. I almost can't consider Yale my favorite because he's too close to me. So I'll say, though, the character of Julian, who's someone that we see is just, kind of a goofy friend at a party, but he has, without giving much away, he evolves later in the book significantly. He was someone, sometimes when you write, it's not that it's magic or anything, but sometimes a character just sort of shows up fully formed, and you know exactly what they're going to do and say, and it's a big personality. And he was like that for me. He just kind of showed up. So I'm very fond of him, and I'm very fond of Dr. Cheng, of Yale's doctor, who is based, in pieces on various amazing AIDS doctors that I spoke to, and descriptions of doctors that I heard from people who had been patients or who had spent time around patients. So I'm very fond of him too.
If you have to tell about this book in 2 sentences to convince these people who are sitting here and don't read this book, what will you tell them why they should read this book?
Okay, so I used to have to do this in the US before the book came out. I had my whole thing. I'm going to see if I can remember it. So The Great Believers is the story of one man, a gallery curator living in Chicago in the 1980s, and his journey over the next 7 years as the AIDS epidemic swirls closer and closer to him, and as his life both falls apart and takes on much greater meaning. And I will say that although it is a sad book, it is not a depressing book. It is not a book that makes you want to jump off a bridge. It is a book that is ultimately life-affirming, and that might be cathartic emotionally. It might be a little too relevant, a little more relevant than we would wish right now. But I will say that what's gotten me through the past few years politically in the US, and then everything about this pandemic, all of the people I interviewed, the fingerprints of theirs that are all over this book, their voices in my ears, everything I learned from them, that's been what's gotten me through. And if I can pass a little bit of that on in this book, I'll be very happy.
Okay, Rebecca.
That might have been more.
One more time?
That might have been more than 2 sentences. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's American style, more than 2 sentences. And one of the most important topic in this book is also the death, that we cannot. It's very hard. It's very strong emotions in our lives, and we cannot prepare for this, no matter how and what's happened around, and unpredictable times. But I think so that Fiona wants to rescue everybody and stop this death around her totally, and she feels the guilty that she cannot do it, and she has no power to do it. It's hard. You talk about this. We living in now in the cancer times, that we have to watch when our closer friends and people who we live with are dying, and I think so it's the hard process also. And you show in this book that you can be very close, and you have to be very open for this, and you cannot prepare for this, but you have to be very close to these people, so it's easier to get through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, writing about death, it's interesting. I had this realization as I was working that there were many things I was writing about that I didn't know personally, that other people do know very well. And I had to be very careful. So I'm not gay, and I'm writing about your experience, and that's a scary thing. Am I doing this justice? I don't have HIV, but I will have readers who have HIV, and have I done it justice? But I will not have any readers who are dead. As I'm writing, the one thing that I'm writing about death. Everyone who has ever written about death has had to guess. we are always writing from this side of it. We are never, no one has ever written about death with authority. No one knows how to do that. And so we're always fundamentally guessing. And at least that meant, okay, no one can tell me I got that part wrong. No one can say, well, I died and it wasn't like that. But the proximity of death is certainly something that, we have, we see death. And the older we get, the more that, for most of us, it happens when we're older. I think, for this AIDS generation, just as for certain war generations, it was happening, all of that death, that understanding was happening when they were 22, which is such a different experience.
I have a question from the internet according to death. So, do you have any opinion about this book from the LGBT people who lived the epidemic? They don't die. And if yes, so what kind of opinion about this book from them?
Right, of course. And these were the readers that I was the most nervous about. There were several of the people I interviewed who had great experience with this, who read the manuscript before it went to my editor. So I could know early on if there were issues. Tell me if there's anything that doesn't make sense, that doesn't feel true for you. The response from the AIDS community, from the LGBTQ community, has been beyond anything I dreamed of. It's been so supportive. I was just hoping to I was hoping to not offend anyone at least, right? And in fact, it's been just overwhelming support, which I think is largely thanks to the people I interviewed, to what they were willing to share with me, that I was able to get things right. I've gotten a number of emails, or people come up to me at readings. Many, who have had HIV since the 1980s, or lost their lover to HIV, or lost their son, or any number of things, who have really latched onto the book. The most honored that I've been, there have been several situations where an older gay man who did live through this has asked me to inscribe the book to a younger gay friend, and has said, I want him to understand what it was like because he wasn't there, so I need him to read your book. And that is beyond any response that I could have dreamed of.
So it's kind of education's status of your book a little bit during the young generation.
Yeah. It is. Mm-hmm. Or people, in some cases, some of the people, I've had people come up to me saying, like women in their 60s, saying, I was alive during this time, but I was living in the suburbs, raising my kids, and I had no idea. And that this has been sort of and feeling very guilty often about it, saying, I wish I could have done something. And this has been where I gently say, we still have 1 million people dying globally of AIDS every year. You could still get involved. But people who, not really through a fault of their own, it's simply, it wasn't talked about enough. It wasn't in the news enough. It wasn't in political debate enough. They managed to remain unaware. And this is one of the great powers of fiction. These are not people who would have picked up a nonfiction book about AIDS. These are not people who would have watched a documentary about AIDS, but their book club chose this novel, and they end up getting an education that they weren't expecting.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Rebecca, I think so. Okay. Do we have one more question from the internet? Okay, so so many people said from internet. Okay, I have to learn it. I have to translate it to English myself. Sorry. Many people say that your book is really a ready script scenario for film. Do you hope for adaptation? I have the same. I have the same feeling that it's really good.
Yeah,
it's a really go film.
I hope so. We have, the film has been optioned, which is, actually, it's been optioned for a television series. So a limited series with 8 or 10 episodes. Optioned is just the first step. So Amy Poehler, the comedian, she's not going to turn it into a comedy, don't worry. But her production company, she's the one who bought the rights to it. We have someone now developing it as a director and screenwriter, someone who's really amazing. And the next step would be for us to try to sell this package of the script, some actors attached, this director, to someplace like HBO or Netflix. And of course, everything is, the timeline is strange now because of the pandemic. People can't pitch or start to make things right now. But we're optimistic, and there's some good energy behind it. People are excited about it, so I'm hopeful. And I strongly agree that a television series is the better format, better than a 2-hour movie, because you have more time. And as I said, I realized as I was writing the book that it needed to be a saga. It needed to be stretched out over 7 years or 30 years. We needed room. And I think that's something, we are living in this golden age of television, and that expansiveness is something that I think this is a perfect moment for books like this to come to the screen.
Do you have a dream about somebody who can act in this film?
I have a few ideas, yes. None of these people are actually attached to it, so I don't want to start any rumors, but there's a wonderful actor named Jonathan Mcgraw who, he was, this is not helpful, but he is the voice of the guy with the reindeer in the Disney movie Frozen. But he's a wonderful Broadway actor. He's a beautiful actor. And I think that, and he is gay, and I think that this is a wonderful thing right now too in Hollywood, that 20 years ago, gay actors were very closeted because it would limit the roles they could play. And people are out now, and you can really cast this entirely with gay men. So I have certain characters that I know who I want. I know who I want for Asher. I know, but that's all pipe dream. It's all, it's just something fun to think about at the beach.
Okay, Rebecca, my last question to you is, what in you believe so much? What are your great believers?
Yeah, gosh. I'm not a religious person, so it's nothing like that. But I do, I study humans. I think that's a really important part of being a fiction writer, is to be essentially a social psychologist and to understand what makes people act the way they do. And to write a strong character, you really need to get behind every single person, even when they're making terrible decisions. You need to understand even the villains. You need to believe what they believe. And ultimately, when you do that, when you start to see the world that way, and you start to really try to see things through each individual's eyes, ultimately, almost everyone believes that they are a good person. Almost everyone at least wants to be a good person. And that's something that is very easy to forget when we're in very, fraught political times when we just cannot understand where someone is coming from. But I think that the practice of writing fiction gives me more faith in the humanity of every person, in the possibility that people can understand each other, the possibility that we have more in common than we think we do, and the idea that people are at least trying to do the right thing. And that might not, maybe not everybody, but most people are at least trying to do the right thing, the way that they see it. And believing in that keeps me sane right now.
So let's hope that there will be more good people after the pandemic time and coronavirus times. And maybe, like you said in your book, maybe there will be much more good person who will left the others to live their own lives, to let them live their own lives as they want. And I think so it's the pausa at the end of this conversation. Rebecca, I would like to thank you very much. Thank you, the people who was watching us, who was being with us. I know it's at 12 in the noon at Chicago, so we are starting a day and we are finishing a day. And we are waiting for your next books to translate in Polish, because I'm sure this one is the start, the journey with your novel on Polish market. So take care of yourself, and we will follow your next books.
Thank you so much. This was lovely. I hope to get there in person soon when this is all over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, one more time. Bye.
Bye.
Yep.